chapter. Now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow. And for fear of him the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and they ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them, saying, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Amen. That's our passage for this morning that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be focusing mainly on the last 4 verses of Matthew chapter 28. And we're going to be thinking about a question this morning, and the question is this: what is the aim of the church? What is the aim of the church? What should we here at Capernwray, and what should any church, for that matter, be aiming at? If I was to hand out a piece of paper this morning and you were to write down a sentence or two, what is the aim of the church? I wonder what you would write. We've been thinking, haven't we, over the last few weeks about all things church. We've been thinking about what is the church, and we've noted 2 things about the church, 2 kind of big ideas regarding the church. The first one was that the church is a spiritual house. The church is a spiritual house, not a physical building, but a building of people, the place where God lives. And it's a people who believe in Jesus and a people who belong to God. That's the first thing we noted. The second thing was that the church is God's household. It's God's family. We saw in Ephesians 2 that the church are those who are united to Jesus and therefore part of God's family. And in Jesus, we are united to one another as well. Even though we're all very different, in Jesus, we are made one. And this morning, we're thinking about the purpose of the church. In a world of limited time and resources and energy, what should we focus our time and our resources and our energy on doing as a church? I think this is an important question. There's a phrase that's been coined the last few years. The phrase is mission drift. I don't know if you've heard that phrase before, or mission creep. They mean the same thing. It originally was a phrase that was coined by the military. It was recognised that when a military operation was underway at the start of the campaign, there was very well-defined objectives and aims. And then as the battle went on, it was just really common that these objectives and aims would broaden or they would be diverted, and suddenly the original aim is no longer the aim, and the mission has crept. It's also been employed in the business world. So charities is the common one, where someone starts a charity with a very good intention. It normally comes out of the convictions of an individual or a small group of people. But then over time, as the original founders move on and other people take over, it's very easy for the aims of a charity to shift. And sometimes a charity that begins doing one thing 50, 70 years down the line can be doing something totally different. And it can be the same with churches. If we don't keep our focus on what we're meant to be doing, our mission can drift. And I think this is why we see so many churches of all sorts of varieties and types. A church springs up with a clear focus, a biblical focus, and then over time that focus drifts and the church ends up being some kind of social club. And then a new church springs up in that area. So mission drift is a very possible thing for churches as well. And we find the answer to the question of what should churches do here in Matthew 28. And in two words, I would say the aim of the church is to make disciples. That's what we should be about here at Capon Bray, making disciples. Let's look more closely at verses 16 to 20. Jesus has instructed his disciples to go to Galilee and to meet him on the mountain. There's 11 disciples now. Obviously, Judas has betrayed Jesus, so there's only 11. There may be other disciples along with these 11. I'm not sure. You can't quite tell from the text. But they're to meet Jesus on the mountain. And meetings on mountains are really important in the Bible. Meetings on mountains are really important. Meetings on mountains are where man meets God. It's a pattern. So Moses, he goes up and he meets God on Mount Sinai. You have Elijah, he meets God at Mount Hebron. And Jesus, in Matthew's Gospel, has been up on the mountain with his disciples, and they've had that transfiguration, where Jesus has gone shining bright, and the words from heaven have come, "This is my Son, with whom I'm well pleased, listen to him." So meetings are important. It's where God meets man. And we know this is significant because it's a meeting on a mountain. If I was to say to you, do you want to meet up at some point this week, have a chat? And you would say, yeah, that's fine. Or Wednesday, 1 p.m., where do you want to meet? And I say to you, well, let's meet at the top of Ingleborough. Let's meet. You would look at me like I have two heads. Climbing Ingleborough is hard work. It takes a long time, and there's much easier places to meet. So meetings on mountains are a bit out of the ordinary, and this is really significant. Meetings on mountains are also where God gives his people instructions. So back at Mount Sinai, Moses receives the law from God, instructions for his people. Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, he's been up on the mountain and he's done the Sermon on the Mount. He's preached with great authority. He says, "You've heard it said," and then he would quote the law, and then he would say, "But I say to you." So instruction, it's where instruction are given. And it's the same in this last meeting. It's Jesus' final meeting. Final words are always significant. And this is on a mountain, so it's especially significant. And Jesus gives his disciples what is become known as the Great Commission. We read that the disciples, when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted, or some translations have hesitated. So this group of disciples, the 11, maybe more other disciples as well, they worship him, but there's some of their number that hesitate or doubt. I think some of these disciples are still coming to terms with the resurrection. Jesus, who they knew was dead, is now alive. Some people, when they talk about the resurrection, they say, oh of course, it's a kind of primitive, pre-scientific belief. People back then thought people could rise from the dead, but now we know that they can't. This is just some kind of superstitious belief. They were fooled. And yet people back then, just like people now, know that dead people don't rise from the dead. That's just like an observation. And what the disciples are coming to terms with is that in the resurrection of Jesus, something new has happened. Something new has happened that kind of destroys all the old observations. They've been observing for thousands of years that people didn't rise from the dead, and now Jesus lives. They see him, and they're worshipping, but they're also hesitating. And to this worshipping doubting, hesitating group of disciples, Jesus gives this commission. And I want us to note three things about this commission this morning. The first thing we see is the foundation for making disciples. The foundation for making disciples. Verse 18 says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." That's a startling claim, isn't it? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is revealed as one who has authority to forgive sins. He teaches with great authority. Even his enemies recognize his authority. And here Jesus makes this claim, all authority, whether in heaven or on earth, it's been given to me. I just want to pause a minute and think about people who you know who have authority over you. Maybe it's an employer at work who tells you what you should and shouldn't do. The police force, as the embodiment of the law, they have authority over us, don't they? The people who make our laws, they have authority over us. But I think in our kind of democratic society, we struggle to understand this concept of ultimate authority. Because all authority that people have, it's mediated by other people. And ultimately, in a democracy, the authority lies with the people. But in other countries and at other times, there have been people who have had real ultimate authority. Think of dictatorships where people have maintained authority by tyrannical rule. A present-day example would be North Korea. People who live under these sort of dictatorships, they understand the concept of authority. Someone having complete authority over what you're allowed to say and do. Jesus is making a claim to ultimate authority. It's not an authority that he's grasped for himself. It's an authority that has been given to him by his Father. And Jesus wields the authority that he has without any hint of corruption. You see that in the Gospels. Jesus only uses his authority for good. And Jesus has authority, all authority in heaven and on earth. We don't see that acknowledged at the minute fully. Not everyone lives under God's rule. People are still rebelling against his rule. There's a kind of now and not yet about Jesus' rule, but there will be one day when his rule will be complete. And there's no place in the cosmos that Jesus does not rightfully claim, that is mine. And Jesus is Lord over each of us this morning, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. And it's Jesus' authority that is the foundation for making disciples. And I think, unless we as a church are convinced that Jesus has all authority, we will shy away from making disciples. Instead, we will bow and submit to other authorities, to what other people think. There's a word that kind of seems to hold sway in our society at the minute. It's the T word, tolerance. People use it all the time. We have to tolerate one another. And there are some people who say something like this. They say, "Who are you, Christian, to tell me what I should believe? Who are you, Christian, to seek to try to convert the Hindu? Who do you think you are to say that Jesus is Lord? Mr. and Mrs. Missionary who travel abroad to a different country, who do you think you are to go to another country and tell them that they should submit to Jesus, to tell them that Jesus is Lord and died for their sins?" That kind of missionary activity, well, people say that's just a fallout from an imperialistic age when white people used to use religion as a kind of tool to control people. Who do you think you are to say that Jesus is Lord and try and convince other people of that? That's the kind of flavour, at least what I get as I read the newspaper and listen to the news. And yet we see here that as his disciples, we have an authority that's derived from the one who has all authority. We are to go and make disciples because we've been commanded to by the one who has all authority. And there are times in the past when people have misused Jesus' words for greedy gain, and that should perhaps make us cautious or careful, but it shouldn't stop us making disciples. And the fact that Jesus has all authority is the foundation on which we build. And maybe over the next week, it'd be worth for each of us just spending a little bit of time to think over those words in verse 18. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Just spend time thinking of those words and allowing the truth of what Jesus says just to penetrate your heart. And after telling them that he has all authority, Jesus then gives them instruction. And the instruction of the Great Commission centers on those two words, make disciples. Make disciples. Because Jesus' authority isn't limited to certain times or certain places, the command is to go and make disciples of all the nations. Christianity isn't a local religion just for local people. Christianity is a global religion for the whole world. Because Jesus has authority over the whole world. Near the start of Genesis, we read the Tower of Babel, and this word nations that we read in Matthew 28 is an important word in the Bible. It comes up over and over again. In Genesis chapter 11, we have the kind of creation of nations as God scatters the peoples at the Tower of Babel. The people have tried to show how great they are and build this great tower, and God has scattered them, different languages and different peoples. And then in Genesis chapter 12, we have the call of Abraham. And God calls Abraham, and he says to Abraham, you've got to go from your father's house and go out to a land I'll show you. And he says, I will bless you. He says, I'll give you a great name, Abraham. And then he says to Abraham, also in you, Abraham, all the nations, all the peoples of the world will be blessed. And what we see in the Great Commission is many, many years from that first call of Abraham is the unfolding further of God's great plan to bless the nations in Abraham. Because Jesus, obviously, he's from the family of Abraham. He's Abraham's seed. And as the message about Jesus is to go out to all the nations, that's where they find blessing through Abraham's line. And that's why the disciples have to go. Originally, they want to stay in Jerusalem. But God sends persecution. He makes sure that these first disciples go with this message about Jesus. And they're scattered through persecution to Judea and Samaria and around Jerusalem. And as these disciples go, they also make disciples in obedience to Jesus. And eventually, the message of the disciples reached our fair shores. And that's why we're here this morning. It's because those first disciples obeyed the commission from King Jesus, and they made disciples, and those disciples made more disciples, and those disciples made more disciples, and we are here this morning meeting as Jesus' disciples. So for us to go, for a few of us, it may mean that we go. It's a change of location. It may mean for some of us that we move somewhere else to make disciples. But I suspect for most of us, that's not the case. For most of us, it's as we are going, we make disciples. As we are going about our day-to-day life, as we go to work or school, as we're at home or with our friends, that's when we are to be making disciples, as we go about our day-to-day lives. What does it mean for us to make disciples? There are two words in this passage that I think characterize what it means for us to make disciples as a church. The first one is baptizing, and the second one is teaching. Two words that characterize what it means to make disciples: baptizing and teaching. First of all, baptizing. There's a lot we could say about baptism, but we'll try and focus on what is in this passage. And we can see from this passage that when people are baptized, baptism represents joining God's family. That's what baptism as a sign represents. It's joining God's family. So we can see that when we're baptized into the name singular, the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Baptism represents joining God's family. Baptism, amongst other things, is a sign that marks entrance into the community of God's people. It's kind of marks the beginning of the Christian life. And it's important we don't confuse the sign of baptism with the reality. Getting baptized doesn't make you a Christian. No, repenting and receiving Jesus makes you a Christian. But baptism is the sign that marks the beginning of a new life in Jesus. And in the New Testament, the sign of baptism and the reality of entrance into God's family are held really tightly together. And baptism reminds us that trusting Jesus is not only something personal and private, but trusting in Jesus is also something that's public and physical. That's what people do. It's a public declaration. Our faith is to affect our actions, and baptism is the first of those that we do in obedience to Jesus Christ. In places where Christians are persecuted, and maybe someone converts from a different religion to become a Christian, to become a disciple of Jesus, it's often not at the time of conversion that they face persecution when you read stories. The time that they begin to face persecution from families and friends, it's at the moment of their baptism. Because other religions recognize that receiving the sign of Christianity, the sign of baptism, is of great significance. Sometimes in churches, we have a too low a view of baptism, I think. There are definitely churches who have a too high view of baptism. They think that when people are baptized, that makes them Christians. We don't believe that, but it's possible to have a too low view of baptism and think baptism is optional. Yeah, some people get baptized who are Christians and some people don't, and that's okay. No, baptism is of great importance. And we're reminded this morning that as a church, we should set our focus on making disciples. And the first part, or the first instruction that characterizes making disciples, is baptizing. I wonder this morning, there may be people here who have received Jesus, who are Christians, who are living a life of repentance and faith, and have not yet been baptized. I'd encourage you to have a chat with me after. Baptism's really important if we're going to take Jesus' words seriously here in Matthew 28. And as a church, we should focus on helping to bring people to the point of baptism where they want to declare Jesus Christ is Lord and he died for my sins and I want to get baptized. That's the work that we should be about as a church, helping people to get to that point. That work includes everything from the first time people hear about Jesus right through to the baptism and service when we all join together as a church and baptize someone. That's the first activity that characterizes discipleship. The second is teaching. If the command to baptism is about increasing numbers of disciples, the command to teach is about maturing disciples. It's about growing disciples up into Jesus Christ. So we are to teach Jesus everything. We are to teach disciples everything Jesus commanded. That's what it says. Is that what it says? No, it says we are to teach disciples to obey everything that Jesus commanded. Not just to teach them the command, we're to teach people to obey. The aim of teaching is never just kind of gaining intellectual facts. That's not the aim of teaching. The aim of teaching is obedience. Obedience to Jesus' commands. And when you hear the word teaching, don't just think this kind of thing, someone stood at the front, teaching in a very formal way. This is a kind of teaching, and that's the aim of what we do on a Sunday morning, to make disciples. But teaching also happens when people meet one-on-one and twos and threes, and they teach one another, they encourage one another in the gospel. They remind one another of the truth about Jesus as people meet and pray together, and perhaps, if needed, sometimes a loving rebuke. That's also teaching. And teaching is the job of the whole church. It's been said of the church that the church perhaps is in the habit of making converts, but not making disciples, trying to get people to make decisions, but then not growing people up. And there perhaps is some truth in that. Making disciples is not just a numbers game, but it's about maturity. And the word disciple and the word learner, they're kind of the same root. And to be a disciple is to be a learner. The community of God's people has always been a community of teaching and learning. Old Testament and New Testament. I'll read you some verses from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house. You shall walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be on the frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. God's people have always been a community of teaching and learning, and that's why we gather. When we gather together, we look closely at God's word. And we learn in order to do, and we learn then in order to teach. Can you see in these verses that Jesus' words create a kind of self-perpetuating cycle? So disciples are to learn and to do, and then to teach. And part of teaching these new disciples is to teach them to also make disciples. So intrinsically, part of being a disciple is making other disciples. And our discipleship is lacking if we are not seeking to make other disciples. The two are tied together. And this is the work of the church body as a whole. It involves each one of us. We'll think in a few weeks about the church as a body, how we all have different gifts and different roles working towards this one task of making disciples. But baptizing and teaching involves every member of the church. And it's really important that we just take time this morning to refocus on what we are meant to be about as a church. We are meant to be about the task of making disciples. I remember hearing a saying when I was a medical student, and the saying went like this: see one, do one, teach one. See one, do one, teach one. It was a reference to kind of medical procedures like taking blood or putting drips in. You watch one, and then you do one. It's maybe not the most reassuring thing for people to hear, but you watch one, you do one, and then you teach one. And there was a variant on that phrase that went YouTube one, do one, teach one. But that's the idea, is that the final step in the process isn't your doing, but it's the next person's doing. That's the final step in the process. And it's the same with discipleship. Our discipleship isn't the end of the road. It's not the last step in the process. It's the next person's discipleship that is the end of the process. And my prayer for us as a church is that we would have increasing clarity about this focus as we meet together and as we go about our day-to-day lives. That our prayer as a church and individuals would be, Father, help me today to help someone else along the path towards the point of baptism. And help me today to encourage someone who already knows Jesus to live in closer obedience to him. This is the dual focus: baptizing and teaching people obedience to Jesus. And this focus, in a way, is freeing. Once you know, or once we as a church know what we are aiming at, we also know what we're not aiming at. I remember when I went from doing GCSEs to doing A-levels. At GCSE, you have to do 11 subjects. At A-levels, you get to drop down to 4. So you can suddenly forget about history and Spanish and IT. You just forget about them. And you can just focus on the 4 subjects that you're doing. And it's helpful for us to get a clear focus as a church on what we are to be about, because we can realize then also what we don't have to do. And as we think about making disciples, finally and quickly, there is a promise for disciple makers in verse 20. This is a great promise. Jesus says, "And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Jesus has been with his disciples for 3 years. He's lived life alongside them. They've eaten together. He's taught them. And now he's about to leave. And he reminds them that even though he is going, his physical body will ascend to heaven, he is going to be with them by his Spirit even till the end of the age. So this disciple-making process isn't just for the 11 disciples. Jesus sees this process going on to the end of the age, till he returns. And he's not returned yet, so the disciple-making process still goes on. And it's a great comfort to us. The task of disciple-making can seem daunting. And it's a great comfort for us to know as a church that Jesus is with us. Jesus is with us. We join him in his work of making disciples. We're going to look next time at Acts chapter 2, and we will see the outworking of this Great Commission at the end of Acts chapter 2. So we'll look at that next time. As a church, as we seek to refocus or sharpen our focus, we need to always have this promise ringing in our ears. Jesus says, I am with you even to the end of the age. In a moment, we're going to come around the Lord's table, but before we do, we're going to sing a song.